All right, everybody, welcome back to Left the Chat. We are finally done with Capital Volume 1. Congrats, Steve. We went through this entire volume.
It's been a journey. It's been a journey up this mountain, man. But we finally, I can't believe we did it. I can't believe we read. I mean, I've read long ass books before, bro. Like fiction, usually a lot of fiction books. And I've read nonfiction too, but I don't think I think this is the longest nonfiction book I've ever read.
I'm ready to Marie Kondo it and thank it and let it go. But still always come back to it because it's definitely a great foundation to have.
For sure. This little illustrated one you got me. I'll definitely return to this probably. You know, and maybe a year or something, or a couple months from now, just to remind myself of the concepts. I don't know if I'll pull the fucking David Harvey and reread this shit again. That's absolutely.
No, I'd definitely say if you wanted to go back into it again, then just read his companion, which is,
or that. Yeah, I think one of those choices is probably.
I don't reread a lot of books, much less like 1,000 page books or whatever. So anyhow, all right. So in this final video on Capital Volume 1, we are discussing Capital Part 8. It's the final part of Volume 1, and it consists of chapters 26 through 33. So up until this point, particularly in the chapters leading up to Part 8, Marx showed that the closer we get to this utopian liberal market vision put forward by people like Adam Smith, primarily Adam Smith, then the more we find ourselves confronted with this consequence of centralization of power, and like I brought up in the last video, this immense concentrations of wealth on one end, and then just like misery and shit for the working class, right, on the other.
Like today.
like today, yes. So just before going into Part 8, just kind of like to recap and just our thoughts, I guess, a little bit on the book so far. I mean, and so far as like stuff coming true, I guess, as far as like the neoliberal project of the last like 40 years is concerned, a lot of Marx's predictions in terms of like centralization and the proportion of like national income being held by like the 1% being, you know, greater than what's held by like the 50%, or, you know, what I'm saying. We're living in this time where like the CEO pay ratio has soared and stuff. So a lot of those trends that Marx predicted, you know, did come true. What did you say? Would you agree?
I absolutely 100,000% agree with that. I think the things where he failed on were kind of things related to the ways in which capitalists have gained a large majority of their profits. I think a large majority of it has now come from what they would call money capital, or finance capital, rather than industrial capital, and that's just a result, I think, of the times. The man was writing in the time of the Industrial Revolution, so he did obviously mention certain parts, even in some of these chapters, about kind of the rise of the bankocracy, which we'll touch upon, I'm sure. But it was kind of the burgeonings of that, right? Just like it was the burgeonings of industrial capital, but I guess the industrial capital side was just in his face, whereas the other stuff was a little more subtle. Where I think now it's kind of like reversed, where the finance capital is taken over. But this book impressed me tremendously. Like we've talked at length already, and I won't beat a dead horse here about the way it was written and the sense of like sometimes he drags and repeats himself for sure. But I think a lot of his major concepts, I guess, his major ideas, I think still hold a lot of water, with the exception of those things I just mentioned, and also perhaps more like the economic theory in the sense of certain concepts may not carry over that we'll study now when we read Kelton and Harvey and not Harvey, Kelton and all of these other modern day economists will probably learn something different. But yeah, I think the major concepts, I think there's a lot we can take away.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the only thing I'll say is just insofar as him being a pioneer and like the field of critiquing capitalism, right, and like the established economic order of the time. I mean, nobody before him had done so in such like an organized and like systematic way and put forward these volumes critiquing it. But at the same time, like we've discussed, you know, he took a lot. It was basically all like English based, right? Like all was going on in England at the time,
right?
And not globally. And he was kind of, at least in Volume 1, he looks at it in this closed system and just, you know, assumes that this is how happens all over the world.
True, absolutely. He is writing from a very particular perspective,
Right.
and yeah, and like, obviously, in all the things about the labor theory of value, which we've touched upon in various videos, I don't know how much that holds water, like we've discussed, but yeah, no, man, this was impressive, and also just his ability to kind of mesh different fields of study. Like certain chapters, like we've talked about, he kind of goes into this very deep historical almost analysis of things. Other times, it's more of a sociological analysis about the conditions of the people of the day, their living conditions, and things like that. And us, it's historical, but for him, it wasn't, right? It was present day. And then he gets into this more like philosophical mode, talking about what is the commodity and what is money and things like that. And then he also, has this whole more of like economical or accounting kind of thing. So the fact that he was able to kind of like bounce around, I think Harvey talks about this too, is just like from chapter to chapter, he kind of changes his mode of analysis depending on what topic he is covering. And that was kind of cool. It was kind of jarring at some points, but it was interesting anyway to go through it and kind of see those kind of see the analysis of capital from those different lenses.
For sure, yeah. When you're saying like the different ways he writes, one thing is like one of the ways is also very literary,
right,
using these like monsters and vampires and different analogies. So just taken as a whole, well, before we get into party is mostly historical, and he takes this, which I found is kind of a weird way to end the book. I mean, and like we'll see the last chapters on colonization, and it's just like kind of weird. It doesn't like conclude the book, in my opinion, but it's still important. So, but taken as a whole, Volume 1, he's deconstructing the assumptions of these liberal political economists of the time. He turns them on their head, and he observes that these promises of freedom that ground liberal and neoliberal theory were misleading and even fraudulent, because people were only free in this double sense that they're both free to sell their labor power to who they choose, right? People say all the time, just go work somewhere else if you're not happy with, your CEO or your boss or whatever. But at the same time, they need to sell their labor power in order to live, because they've been freed from any control over the means of production. So they're free in this double sense, right? So, so anyway, so getting into part 8, remember we were talking about primitive accumulation, how there needed to be this accumulation of capital before capitalism as an economic system could take hold. So part 8 is mostly historical, and it explores some of the violent origins of capitalism, you could say, according to Marx, which again is primitive accumulation. And he takes up how this question of freedom, which I was talking about, this freedom from owning the means of production by the working class was secured, and then how labor power ended up becoming a commodity, and then really more generally how the working class was formed. Give me a second, my dog is biting my nails.
Puppy time, puppy breaks. Yeah, man. This chapter, I actually enjoyed this section. I do agree with you that it was kind of a weird placement. You would expect it to be towards the beginning of the book, to kind of establish how did the capitalists get here. So he's almost like, taking like a weird oh, by the way, prequel time. This is how the capitalists accumulated all their cash in order to do all the things I was just talking about. But I did enjoy them. They were short. They were kind of to the point, and they were interesting. The biggest thing I got out of this, one of the interesting passages, was he talks about in 873, kind of the myth, right? The myth that even to this day, a lot of defenders of capitalism will go to. It's like, well, it all started because people, about way back when, were just really frugal. They saved their money, you know what I mean? And then that's how they were able to buy land and buy businesses and stuff. It's because they didn't waste it on, booze and coffee and lattes and shit.
It was just a peaceful transition, right?
Right.
From feudalism into capitalism.
Exactly. It was just like all these guys, they just freaking able to do this. But Marx is like, that's complete bullshit. You know what I mean? Like, that's absolutely not what happened. It was a result, in a large part, of conquest, enslavement, murder. Basically, he says on this, I'm like paraphrasing his quote on page 874, that it was fucking the result of force. You know what I mean? In a large part. It was people killed and pillaged for it.
I'll say really quick. He says on 874, it is a notorious fact that the conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, in short, force, play the greatest part. And one thing that you kind of allude to, but then say directly, is with a lot of assistance from the state at the time also, right? Like the English monarchy and
Absolutely,
and the
yeah.
government, right?
Yeah, I was reading it in the like little like I read ahead in the illustrated capital how it was, yeah, like it was large part the monarchy fighting, because like in the 14th century, you had the landed peasantry and they were basically free essentially for the most part, and then it was a way for, well, we're going to talk about closure in the next chapter, so I don't want to get into that, but yeah, man, basically all these fucking monarchists were like, yo, these peasants are getting out of control, like we need to figure this fucking out, and lo and behold, colonialism, closure, etc.
Some other evocative, I guess, quotes that he says in the first chapter of these few, chapter 26. He says on 875 that the history of primitive accumulation is, quote unquote, is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire. And then later on 926, he says that capital comes dripping from head to toe from every pore with blood and dirt. So like you were saying, like people put out that, there was this peaceful that transition, right, from feudalism to capitalism. But what Marx says is in actual history, this is what happened. So then he goes into some detail of how this happened. On chapter 27 onward, he goes on to these historical details. So in chapter 27, he gives this account of the serfdom in England and the peasantry, and how the expropriation of peasants' land over these hundreds of years created the groundwork for capitalism, right? And peasants were often forced off their land violently with help, like I said, of the English government at the time. So that first chapter 27, he goes over how people were kind of thrown from their land in order to lay the foundation and groundwork of capitalism.
Yeah, chapter 27 was basically about, like I started to talk about, was enclosure. The whole idea that peasants originally kind of owned lands in common, what were known as the commons, where they would grow food, they would share livestock. People would primarily spend most of their time working for themselves and subsisting for themselves, and then a small part of their time was spent harvesting food or like small products like wool and shit like that for the lord, the local baron or whatever. But then after a while, the monarchy was like, we're losing money and what the fuck is going on? And then they started basically enacting laws to forcibly remove these peasants from these lands, because they saw, and this was a result of the beginnings of, I guess, the age of discovery, right? Like they went off to these lands and people needed to supply these colonies with these products. And merchants were going off to China and bringing back silk and all this shit, and they were making money. And they were like, wait, the original landowners were like, wait a minute, we need to get in on this. How we're going to do that? We're like, well, instead of letting all these fucking peasants grow tomatoes and shit, we're going to kick them all off, and we're going to make this into sheep walks. We're going to put a fucking 100,000 sheep on this shit, and then collect wool from it, and that's where we're going to make money. And that's basically the beginning of capital. And then what happens? You got a bunch of thousands of peasants that suddenly don't have means to subsist and means to survive, and lo and behold, you got wage labor.
So then you go into chapter 28 is answers that question of what happens to this kicked off agricultural population, or these peasants, like what are they going to do now that they're kicked off their land. So that's the topic of chapter 28. I wanted
27.
to quote
27.
No. Well, that was 27, but then moving on into 28, he kind of he talks about what happens to the people. So 27 is first about them getting the land getting expropriated, and them getting kicked off, and then what happens to these people. So they become beggars, right, and they become vagabonds, and right. So and people don't want to work for somebody else; they want to continue with their lifestyle. So I wanted to quote Harvey a little bit at length here, quick paragraph. He says, often there was no employment for them, so they became, in the eyes of the state at least, vagabonds, beggars, thieves, and robbers. The state apparatus responded in ways that continue to this day. It criminalized and incarcerated them, depicted them as rogues, and visited the utmost violence on them. Thus were the agricultural folk first forcibly expropriated from the soil, driven from their homes, turned into vagabonds, and then whipped, branded, and tortured by grotesquely terroristic laws into accepting the discipline necessary for the system of wage labor. The violence of the socialization of workers into the disciplinary apparatus of capital is at first transparent. But with the passing of time, the silent compulsion of economic relations sets the seal of the domination of the capitalist over the worker. And he quotes Marx a few times in there. So a lot of these people became vagabonds, and then when they didn't want to work, right, the state said what certain kings even were going to enslave people if they didn't want to succumb to being wage laborers.
Basically, like, hey, we're going to throw you off your land, and now that you either don't have a skill that where you want, or you just can't adapt. You've been a fucking farmer your whole entire life, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, we need you to come, whatever, become a seamstress inside some wool factory to make clothes. Like, I don't know what the fuck to do that. I don't want to do that. So they become vagabonds, and then they're like, oh yeah, but it's illegal to be a vagabond, which is in modern terms, whatever, man, a homeless person, or
right.
a person, a pauper, right, a poor person, and this happens still today. We still criminalize homelessness in our local municipalities. You can't sleep on sidewalks. It makes it illegal. You have kind of forms of architecture. We build it into our architecture to prevent things like vagabondism and homelessness by making benches with, like the bar in the middle, so you can't sleep on it, or underneath overpasses you have those fucking spikes and shit. It's awful. But we're still, this is an example of, like, this is something that was written in the 1800s, but we're still dealing with very similar concepts to this day.
Yeah, just in terms of also how, like, jobs have become such people's identity, I guess, right? If you're not working or something, then you're like a bum, right? You're lazy or something. And
yeah, that's there's also that kind of social aspect to it, right? You're just not, like, I don't know, you're just not respected because you don't have a job or whatever, without even thinking about, like, oh, like, what are this person's skills? It's not, sometimes it's not the fault of the person that they didn't acquire the skill. It's that there was some major change in society, and all of a sudden these people can't contribute in the same way. And that's another example that's happening today, right? Like, that's happened many times throughout history, in the 80s and 90s, and now, with the digitization of everything.
And the great irony is that, of course, capitalism needs these vagabonds and this unemployment base to exist. So.
Exactly. We talked about that at length in one of these other videos about the reserve army, right?
The industrial reserve army of labor.
One thing I did want to touch upon before we move on to 31.
29.
Sorry, 29. Sorry, Bob. Was on page 901. Marx actually talks about how they started to outlaw in order to make this transition, right, from feudal economies to what we understand now as a capitalist economy. They outlawed combinations, which are essentially guilds, right? So on 901, he's like, all combinations, contracts, oaths, etc., by which masons and carpenters reciprocally bound themselves were declared null and void. Workers' combinations are treated as heinous crimes from the 14th century until 1825, the year of the repeal of the laws against combinations. The point is that they were even thinking, like, yo, we can't let these workers get together. And this is basically an old form. A guild, in my mind, is an old form of a union.
A union, yeah.
And these guys at that time were well aware that this is, they even back then, we got to break apart these things, because if not, we're not going to be able to expropriate and exploit these workers without that. So I thought that was an interesting little observation. Again, something that we're very much dealing with in modern times.
So then chapter 29 examines the genesis of the capitalist farmer. Marx tells a simple tale of how bailiffs, which are, I guess, overseers of farms, is what I took from it, how bailiffs
I think so.
became then sharecroppers, who then became tenant farmers, who then came to pay ground rent or money to landlords. You could go into more detail if you'd like about
Dude, honestly, I don't even have many notes on here, with the exception of, like, he's just explaining what you just said. He's just explaining how I guess how, like, in what we would call, like, large scale farms, like who ended up controlling these sheep walks and shit like that. He basically expounds on that. The usurpation of the common lands allowed the farmer to augment greatly his stock of cattle almost without cost, while the cattle themselves yielded a richer supply of manure for the cultivation of the soil. The continuous rise in the prices of corn, wool, meat, in short, all agricultural products, swelled the money capital of the farmer without any action on his part. So he just went into detail of how did these farmers that ended up becoming in control of these large scale farms, how did they make their money, essentially? It's a very short chapter.
So then chapter 30 covers the impact of, there's this agricultural revolution that came as a result of capital, circulating through the countryside, and he covers the impact of that revolution. So at the same time, it set free a lot of labor, but it also commodified the food supply at the same time, because now all of a sudden people had to go to the market to buy their food and not just grow it themselves.
Can't just grow it in the soil anymore. You got to come to Walmart.
Or members of the peasant class, were used to bartering for goods within their community, but now they have to go to the market. And, it creates this whole wage labor situation where people have to, go work for money in order to go buy food. Instead of bartering. So, all right. So then chapter 31 then examines the genesis of now the industrialized capitalist versus the agricultural capitalist we just talked about. The industrial capitalism formed quickly by utilizing money made from usurer and merchant capital. And much of the force he refers to in this chapter is related to colonialism. And like we talked a little about earlier, the enslavement of people and the or indentured servitude of a lot of indigenous people at the time in order for capitalists to amass wealth. Anything else on 31? My notes
on 31, I mean, no, he kind of just, well, I think a major part of 31 is he starts to talk about on page 915, I think. Let's see. Certain. Starts talking about at length of colonials. Page 915, he says, this discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation and enslavement and entombment in mines of the indigenous population of that continent, and the beginnings of the conquest and plunder of India, and the conversion of Africa into a preserve for the commercial hunting of blackskins are all things which characterize the dawn of the era of capitalist production. So he, kind of starts in very specific terms, basically outing out colonialism as the real start of when human beings were really at the basis of a lot of this wealth accumulation. This primitive accumulation was the result of colonialism. That was one of the things that stuck out to me. And also another interesting thing, he touches upon in 919 the beginnings of like the national debt system and system of public credit.
Right. How countries started to amass debt. That was another.
Yeah. So this is what we talked about I started saying at the beginning of our chat here. Is he starts talking about how the idea of the public debt system started in Venice and Genoa, and then eventually it moved on to the rest of Europe, driven by the colonial system, right? All of these major countries needed a way to finance all these expeditions and all this shit, and the way they started doing it by turning to these private banks essentially for loans. And this ended up becoming one of the most powerful levers of primitive accumulation, was basically working off credit. And it gave rise to joint stock companies.
Taxes as well.
And taxes. And well, the tax has been around for a long time, but joint stock company was a major thing. East India Company and shit like that, right? Was kind of the rise of these, were possible because of they were able to get loans from these banks, and then thus starts the modern bankocracy. And he also points out in 921, people even in this day, meaning back then, blamed the public debt for misery and the stuff that was going around there. Like, oh, well, it's because we've amassed all this public debt. And I thought, and he called bullshit on that too, even back then. So I thought this alludes to conversations that are happening now around things like MMT and stuff like that, how that's all bogus.
He says on 921, overtaxation is not an accidental occurrence, but rather a principle.
But yeah, that's all I had on there. Those kind of three things: colonialism, national debt, and public debt still being.
One thing I didn't say at the beginning of this video that I wanted to say was that the part 8 is called so-called primitive accumulation. I wanted to point out that was kind of a jab at Adam Smith, because Adam Smith used the term primitive accumulation without this historical analysis that Marx brings to it. So one thing which I wanted to kind of conclude on was also that there's this, reclaiming, there's this new reclamation of the concept of primitive accumulation, as it's not limited to just the beginning of capitalism, but it's something that needs to continue in order for capitalism to continue existing. But maybe I'll touch a little bit on that at the end, but not necessary. So that's 31. 32 I don't have a lot on. It's mostly he just summarizes a lot of what he covers throughout part 8. He recaps a lot of the movement from primitive accumulation to early capitalism. Anything on 32 with you?
No, I think the only interesting thing is on page 929, it's another really short, like 2-page chapter, but he starts talking about the transformation. This is a direct quote from the book. The transformation of scattered private property resting on the personal labor of individuals themselves into private properties is naturally an incomparably more protracted, violent, and difficult process than the transformation of capital's private property, which in already effect rests on the carrying on the production of society into social property. So he's just talking about mostly about private property and how we started transitioning from these modes of public ownership. Like I was talking about before, lands held in common, the commons, people like going to that. Little by little, it was this expropriation and also the establishment of private property as a means to further this accumulation.
Yeah, and there's a differentiation between private property held in like a small scale private property and like smaller communities versus this large scale private property like the entire means of production, or these capitalist factories or whatnot. So then chapter 33 is the last chapter of the book, and he examines the use of colonization within capitalism, and he mostly uses these ideas set forth by somebody called E.G. Wakefield, who in short, quote unquote, discovered that capital is not a thing but a social relation between persons which is mediated through things, and how capitalism gave rise to the necessity of colonialization and going to places that haven't been touched in order to extract the labor from the countryside, I guess.
Yeah. One thing, I guess, and this I didn't learn from the book, this I learned from the lecture, but apparently this chapter was kind of a response to something that Hegel wrote. And apparently Hegel had this whole idea around colonization, that societies could relieve the issues of inequality, of the idea that, little by little over time, you're going to have these massive disparities between the rich and the poor. And that societies can resolve these kind of conflicts through colonization because it allows a population to reestablish itself in these colonies to attain wealth, right? So you're poor over here, well, we have this colony over there, just go over there and make your wealth, you know what I mean? Find some gold or whatever. You're not exaggerating, but that's what his idea was. And Marx is kind of responding to us, saying, he's critiquing that ideal in Hegel and saying, no, using the gentleman that you mentioned, Wakefield's theory, because a frontier, the idea of a frontier, a colony, actually causes a labor shortage because people can escape. So you in effect screw yourself because that ends up causing the shortage, which causes wage increases and ends up being bad for the capitalists. So they actually don't want these kinds of things because capital needs wage labor to survive. And create surplus labor, surplus value, or capture surplus value to create surplus value, or capture surplus labor to create surplus value.
Right.
So frontiers work against that whole idea. So I thought that was interesting. Just basically further talking about this idea of expropriation and extractionism, which is really what colonialism is about. It's really just extractionism. And how, and Harvey talks, and I've always, I remember learning about this in my anthropology classes and stuff at length, but Rosa Luxemburg apparently talked a lot about this, and Harvey quotes her towards the end of this lecture, how she observed that imperialism was a very, to this day, still required to keep the capitalist mode of production working. It's not just a matter of extracting surplus value from wage laborers. There's also this very important component of literal extraction from other places, enslavement, imperialism, taking it by force that still goes on and did go on at the beginning in order to keep the wheels of capital turning. It's kind of like you have these two forces.
He talks about Luxemburg's work in his final commentary in the Companion also, and how, and like I was saying, primitive accumulation isn't just strictly talking about the transition from feudalism to capitalism in the early stages of capitalism. It's constantly recurring and inherent to the function of capitalism. And this form of imperialism can be a form of primitive accumulation. Taking over the land.
100%.
And it's still McDonald's or whatever.
Yeah, no, and it's still going on. But I think I sent something either today, I think this morning, or I think it was this morning. I put in our chat about how the Supreme Court. Yeah, the fucking Supreme Court just ruled that Nestle and all these chocolate companies are not held liable for the slave practices that go on in Africa because it's not taking place on U.S. soil. That they're using essentially slave labor to extract, cocoa and all those other shit that are raw material to make the fucking chocolate bars. But they're like, oh, but that's not we don't know about that. That's happening in Africa. And they're like, Supreme Court's like, yeah, that's a good excuse, guys. So like, just a perfectly modern example of how imperialism continues to drive the capitalist blood-sucking machine into this day. That was pretty much what I got out of that chapter. And one other cool little tidbit is that basically, I guess there's like three ideas that come out of capitalist production. Is, well, many things come out of it, but at least when we're talking about the methods that capitalists use to accumulate, is one, wage labor, all right, capturing that surplus value. Two, this imperialism, and three, something that David Hardy talks about, which is accumulation via dispossession, which I thought was an interesting concept, where things like you lose things that you originally had. So like things like Social Security, right? Like you suddenly start losing benefits, or austerity, right? Or BlackRock suddenly investing in buying houses that people lost, and now they're buying them and grabbing them and appropriating them that way. So it's not necessarily extraction via imperialism or expropriation via surplus labor, but just literally taking it away from something that you really had.
A lot of the commodification of a lot of public goods like education and things like that.
Exactly, that's another perfect example. Something that we used to get for free that all of a sudden you have to fucking pay for.
Mm-hmm.
That's and Harvey was saying like that seems to be a very large, or that seems to be the transition that's happening now. Since capitalists are not being able to extract so much surplus value anymore from wage laborers, there's not, even though we just gave an example, there isn't that much imperialism still going on. There's not these colonies you can suddenly exploit, at least in vast quantities.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to look for something else. So they're literally just like, well, we're just gonna take it from fucking people. Fuck it.
Well, so that does it for Capital Volume 1. I guess it is a weird way to end the book, in my opinion, but maybe, it is the first volume and he goes into two other volumes, or, So that does it for Capital Volume 1. Join us next time and Left to Chat, when I believe we'll be discussing Killing the Host by Michael Hudson. Steve, you know more about it if you want to give just a quick 2-sentence.
No, I guess a quick little blurb is that I thought this would be a good little transition to move into, because he is a modern economist. He's talking about modern things, which a colleague and I wanted to move on to and get out of kind of this historical kind of perspective. We wanted to get this kind of foundation and put this under our belt, but we wanted to move on to something a little more modern. So I thought this would be a good transition, because he's talking about something that Marx doesn't really touch upon, which I think is a major thing that's happening in current capitalism, which is finance. Specifically what he calls terms the fire sector, which is finance, insurance, and real estate, and how those three major parts of capitalism are essentially parasitic, and cause a lot of the woes that we are facing today. But he considers himself, I guess, a modern form of a classical economist. So I thought, okay, this is an interesting transition, but not too far of what we know.
For sure. I'm looking forward to it. All right, guys. Take care.
All right, until next time.